Hey everybody, today we've got another hypothetical 2024 matchup. This time we've got Joe Biden for the Democrats up against Governor of Vermont, Phil Scott for the Republicans. Somebody suggested this a while back in the comments. It's very difficult, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. So let's get into this one. Phil Scott does seem to come up a lot for the Republicans. I think it's because he's viewed as extremely liberal, and it makes it tricky to fill out a map. So everybody knows Biden. People think he's old. His approval ratings are low. He was able to win in 2020, but could he beat somebody other than Donald Trump? Well, Phil Scott, he's very popular in his home state. Nationally, I don't think people really know who he is. To be fair, I'm going to assume he gets his name recognition up. But what type of campaign would Phil Scott run? If he's going to run as a super liberal Republican, I don't think Republicans are going to turn out for that. Even never Trump Republicans, former Republicans, I think they would view that as too far to the left. If he's going to come out and say Trump is bad and the Republican Party has gotten too extreme, and then if Biden is going to say the same thing, I don't know what incentive there's going to be for many Republicans to come out for Phil Scott. Now, given that he is a Republican, I think a lot of voters will just vote for the party. Now, I'm assuming Phil Scott tries to have at least a shred of appeal to the base. But one other thing that always stands out to me with Phil Scott is back during the COVID vaccine days, he did have a race-based priority period of eligibility. If something like that gets talked about and becomes an issue, I don't think there's any doubt that would hurt Scott. He's not the only one that tried to do something like that. And maybe you think it wouldn't be a big deal, or maybe you even like it. I don't like it at all. So it's hard to know what kind of campaign he would actually run. But I think a lot of Republicans would just view this as two Democrats in the race, and that's going to cause Republican turnout to drop. Now, given the polarization these days, there are still going to be red and blue states out there. So let's quickly go through the map. We'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. And your map, I'm sure, is going to look different than mine. We start in Alaska. That's going to flip. It's going to go leans for Biden. Hawaii, safe for Biden. The West Coast, Washington and Oregon. I think Phil Scott would have just enough appeal here, combined with Biden's lack of appeal, to get this down to a high single-point likely margin for Biden. California, safe for Biden. Nevada, likely for Biden. Idaho and Utah, reduced margins but still red enough, safe for Scott. Arizona, over 5, likely for Biden. Montana, under 10, likely for Scott. Wyoming, safe for Scott. Colorado, could a liberal Republican do better in this state? Well, we saw in the midterms with Joe O'Dea running for Senate, he didn't really do much, so it's going to be safe for Biden. New Mexico, high single digits, likely for Biden. North and South Dakota, safe for Scott. Nebraska at large, it's going to be about 9.5 points likely for Scott. The first district, high single digits, likely for Scott. The second district, that is more suburban. Scott, not a bad fit here, but again, I do think too many actual Republicans are going to stay home. Biden's going to win it by a lean margin. Third district, I don't think they're going to be a fan of Scott there at all, but he's the Republican on the ballot. They're not going to vote for Biden. Scott's going to get it by a safe margin. Kansas, that's going to go under 10, likely for Scott. Oklahoma, safe for Scott. Texas, that's going to be close. I think it's going to flip. It's going to go tilt for Biden. Minnesota, low double digits, safe for Biden. Iowa, I think that would be very close, but it would still go tilt for Scott. Missouri, mid-single digits, likely for Scott. Arkansas, Louisiana, safe for Scott. Up to Wisconsin, likely for Biden. Illinois, safe for Biden. Michigan, high single digits, likely for Biden. Indiana, mid-single digits, likely for Scott. Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, reduced margins. They're not going to be a fan of Scott, but he is going to win it by 10 or more for a safe margin. Down to Florida, even with the rightward trends, I think these are the wrong two on the ballot for Florida. I think it would be competitive, but I do think Biden would win it by at least 1 or 2 points, so leans for Biden. Georgia, that's going to be about 4.5 to 5 points, leans for Biden. South Carolina, that's going to go under 10. It's going to be likely for Scott. North Carolina, that's another one that's going to flip, and it's going to go leans for Biden. Now we go to Ohio. This is going to be super close. Anyone in the Trump direction is not going to turn out in this election. I think Biden is actually going to flip it by a tilt margin. West Virginia, way too red of a state. It's still going to go safe for Scott. Now we go to the corner, Maine at large, safe for Biden. The first district, safe for Biden. The second district, that's usually redder. It's more Trump friendly. Scott is not their guy. Biden's going to win it by a lean margin. Next door to New Hampshire. They're not big Trump fans here, but enough of those voters are going to sit it out. Biden's going to win it by a lean margin. How about Phil Scott's home state of Vermont? It's one of the bluest states in the country, but it also has the most popular Republican governor. I've looked at Biden's approval rating here. It's not too terrible compared to other states, and national politics are different than state politics, but it's Phil Scott. He's the hometown hero. I think he's going to make it impressively close, but he's going to come up short, and it's going to go leans for Biden. New York, Massachusetts, safe for Biden. Connecticut and Rhode Island. Scott is going to have more appeal here than a Trump-style Republican? I'm going to throw him a bone and say these get down to a likely margin for Biden. New Jersey, I'm going to say that's still at about 10.5 points, safe for Biden. Biden's home state of Delaware, we'll say safe for Biden. And Maryland and Washington, D.C. also safe for Biden. How about Pennsylvania? That's going to be similar to the other Rust Belt states. It's going to be over 5, likely for Biden. The last state is Virginia. Some voters in the D.C. suburbs would be willing to cross over and vote for Scott, but throughout the rest of the state, any strong Republicans, and I think most moderate Republicans, they're just going to sit home, and Biden is going to win the state, probably by a high single-digit likely margin. So the final map is 410 for Joe Biden, 128 for Phil Scott. So Biden wins this handily. I've done other ones with Phil Scott. He usually takes the loss, and it's difficult for me to see a matchup where Phil Scott wins. You might completely disagree and say Biden is so unpopular, he's so old, Phil Scott would easily win over the suburbs and former Republicans. Yeah, maybe you're right, but I tend to think that nationally, once Phil Scott gets branded as the lightest Republican in the country, the base support is going to plummet. And I think any voters that are open to a more moderate Republican are still going to be looking for a moderate Republican. I think a lot of voters might wonder if this guy is more of a Democrat than Biden. Now, Scott doesn't do worse in every state. There's a couple on the West Coast and in the Northeast, and Scott puts a dent in the margin, but I still don't think it's going to be enough to really make them competitive. You could also make a case for Minnesota. Maybe you think Illinois goes under 10. It's all a possibility, but to me, Scott is going to lose much more than Biden will. Now, Phil Scott is a nice guy. He's low-key. He's younger than Biden, but I don't think he's really all that exciting, and I don't think he'd ignite a lot of voters. All the normal politicizing issues would come up. I wonder how these two would navigate everything. So I try to think about it as fairly as I can. Of course, you could say maybe Biden's health declines further. Scott is going to do much better. But for me, the most likely outcome is a significant drop-off in support for Scott. It's most dramatic in the Rust Belt, but I still think there's enough there in the Southwest and the Sun Belt that Scott is going to come up short by at least a few points. So this is just what I think. It's likely you're going to have at least a little bit of a different take. So let me know in the comments, what is your take on this matchup? Would anybody beat Biden because he's too old and unpopular? Or would anybody beat Scott because he's too liberal? Let me know down below. On your way out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.